So great to have you here. Please. It really is such fun to see that. I read the entire transcript of your interview and found that really interesting to go and read the whole interview, and of course have read your book, which I enjoyed so much. So I have a few questions for you this evening. And before we get to the book, in looking through the transcript of the interview, you talk about the formative role that Dr. Graf played in your life in terms of bringing you from the US to Zurich to Geneva. And in this complicated world, is this kind of mentorship still possible? Benevolent developmental support the way you received from Dr. Graf?
I think it should be.
What did he do for you, and how do you think we should respond in today's terms to do the same thing?
Well, first of all, I was very lucky. I mean, it was sheer luck. It was by accident. And I was an idiot because at first I objected to it. So
really?
I don't want to go into details. It was just dumb. But Dr. Graf was, first of all, he was unique. Do you know that his father was the #1 music critic in Vienna? He was a friend of Sigmund Freud. When Dr. Graf was 6 years old, he had a fear of fires in his dream, something, and he was analyzed by Sigmund Freud. If you ever study the cases of Sigmund Freud, the case of little Hans, that was Dr. Graf. And then, you know who was his godfather? Gustav Mahler. I mean, it was just, he was unbelievable. But besides all that, he had started as an assistant to Max Reinhardt and all that. As a matter of fact, Betsy, he had gone to school with Mr. Adler. They were, but he was a multifaceted. He had sung, he knew music and all that, and it's just that somehow intellectually and emotionally we just connected. And he had a son. I had one son that he wanted very much to be a stage director like him. The son sadly never made it. And somehow subconsciously I was adopted by him. So I think that's the way. I think it is today. I think it is today. It's because young people need to have someone mature and someone knowledgeable in the business to believe in their potential, to be able there to guide them and help them and all that. And I've been fascinated and motivated by potential talents. So I hope that my colleagues and the more established ones take that as their responsibility so that you keep handing on the torch.
In a way, you did that with Jake in a way, in believing in his talent and giving him an opportunity to produce his first opera in great style at the Great San Francisco Opera. So in a way you have repeated that with Jake some.
Well, I believe, because how the hell are they going to get the opportunity if somebody doesn't believe in their potential? Not always can you hit the jackpot, but you should never give up. I mean, I always feel that it's very important to provide opportunities. Some are going to make it, and some are not going to make it. But if you don't give an opportunity, there's no more development. So that's the way I've always felt, and sometimes it's like a roll of a dice. You're successful or you're not successful.
So your advice to leaders today in the field, people who are experienced, would be to take some time to look around, to...
And take a chance.
Yeah.
Take a chance. Every business in the world is, you have to take a chance. You can't, if you start only playing it safe always, you're not going to get an accomplishment. It's just, then you end up by a very limited kind of a horizon.
In your interview, you also said at one point that you're not an architect. You say, this is about being a general director of an opera company. And you said, I'm not an architect. I have emotions and feelings, and I want to go with that. And I thought it was very interesting to conceptualize the difference between a general director who leads through emotion and feelings and a general director who leads by design and by formula and calculation, the way an architect has to. In today's complicated world, can you lead by feelings and emotions?
Well, you have to explain something to me. What is opera? If it's not emotion, if it's not feeling, that's what opera is. And cold things like buildings and monuments and all that, they have no life. But I think opera has life, has feeling. It deals with emotions. It deals with, So I'm very much for that. I feel that, and I think you have to take a chance. Sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. But if you don't take a risk, then nothing's going to happen. Nothing's, and play it always safe. You're not going to get anywhere.
So you're almost suggesting that you need to lead an opera company using the fundamental building block of opera, which is emotion.
That's it. That's it. I mean, how do you define it? Because, I say it in the book, I think really the book is a kind of a celebration of opera as an art form, because I think opera is the greatest art form created by the human mind. And the fact that opera is a mosaic. It's a lot of parts. And then when these parts are the right parts and they complement one, come together, you've got magic. You've got absolute magic.
In turning to the book, and a lot of people, of course, have memories. Your memories are perhaps somewhat more colorful because of the range of your experience. In committing these to paper, some of the memories, the stories, what is it that you hope to pass along to convey to the reader?
With this book, especially with this book, I mean, look who wrote the foreword. I asked my friend Carol Burnett to write it because I wanted to show that opera is not elitist. It's not this high and mighty temple of art and all this nonsense. That opera is alive and living and etc. And so the whole idea is the fact that even when I list some of the disasters I've had, and as a matter of fact, somebody asked me, what is the theme of your book, this one? I said, it's a series of my disasters. Because...
Well, that only would have been 2 pages.
No, and so I think that's you've got to take a risk. And I think the opera has the potential. And we should not, you see, we have a major problem in the United States. You know what is our major block? The word opera. Because number one, if you go back and you look, how did the word opera invented? The Camerata Fiorentina, when they started in the 1600s in Florence, they called it opera per musica, work with music, and which today we call music theater. But unfortunately, because in America, it all started with rich people. Because the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and all that, they made their millions first. Then all of a sudden they thought, oh, goody, now we have to have a little culture. But if you remember, they subsidized their wives. They didn't necessarily, they would go maybe on Monday night and put their black ties on and all that. But it was the ladies who would have the lunches and the teas and all that kind of stuff. And so the opera in the United States, the word opera itself was foreign, and it was associated with rich people. It was, and if the rich did not pay, there wouldn't be any opera, because the government sure doesn't give a damn, and they don't provide anything. Whereas actually in Europe, opera, or any art, is equated with education. The royalties took place of it, and later on when the royalties were not there anymore, the government took over the responsibility. But in the United States, we have always been stuck with raising money from the rich. And that's the way it's, and I think that's a problem. And the word opera is a little bit of a handicap because it is now has a negative connotation that means ermines and tiaras and limos and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's been a battle for all general directors, not just for me, for all the general directors, because we have had to constantly work to break down this barrier that opera truly is for everyone. For everyone. We work to break down that barrier, as you say, while at the same time we are working to raise money from people with considerable wealth. So it's like a split personality where we're working with the wealthy on one hand and want to get everybody into the opera house on the other. I'm going to say something not very nice. I think as a general director of running an opera company, you've got to be a bit of a whore. Well, you can say that now. I can say that among friends. No, because you have to. Kissy, kissy, huggy, huggy. Oh, Mrs. You will be looking gorgeous tonight. And so on and on and on, because I hope she goes home and write that check. You know, so that's a little bit of our job. But if we're motivated, and also I don't want to generalize. Oh, like in San Francisco, I've had some wonderful, rich embodied. There was a wonderful lady named Phyllis Waters. I don't know if you ever heard. Well, she subsidized Dead Not Walking. And she was the one who said, Lotfi, you can get money for bohemians and butterflies from other people. I will only help you with your new things. And what a nice story I had with her about Dead Not Walking, because what I was used to with Phyllis, when I had a project that I thought it would appeal to her, then I would get the book and I would get the film and I would get all the material and then give it to her. And then I did that for Dead Man Walking. I got the film, I got the book, and, you know, and all that stuff, and I took her over. And then I didn't hear anything from her for about 2-3 months. I started really getting nervous. So I called her up. I said, Phyllis, have you had a chance to look at the? She said, I want to talk to you. Can you come over? So I rushed over at her convenience and all that. And I sat and I said, do you have a problem with this? She said, yes, I do. I said, what is the problem? She said, I am for capital punishment. Boing, you know, so, but I thought of something, and which is very honest. I wasn't doing a number on her. I was honest. I said, look, in the world of opera, we're not politicians. We're artists. And one of our jobs as artists is to expose the audience to important issues. And I said, if I have one daughter, if somebody hurts my daughter, so I'm against capital punishment, but if my daughter is hurt by somebody, I want to kill them. I mean, you know, that's a human nature. And so I think intellectually, I can say, yes, I'm against capital punishment, but emotionally, I only have one child, you know, so. And she thought about it, and I said, think about it. I said, we're not, I'm not, it is not, because at this time, of course, Mr. Bush was busy in Texas and all that stuff. And so, so about a couple of weeks, I didn't hear from her. And then finally she called up, she said, okay, Lotfi, I'll do it. And she gave me $1 million towards the thing. But the final thing was wonderful. At the dress rehearsal, I gave her a supper. I had to thank her for all of that. And this lady was in a wheelchair, you know, because she was, you know, she was older. So all of a sudden, at the end of the room, she said, Lotfi, come over. I was nervous, oh my God. She looked, put her hand on my hand and says, you know, Lotfi, I've changed my mind.
Wow.
I was just, when I say it, I still get chills.
Isn't that something?
I thought it was just, so anyway, so there are people like her that are visionaries and they understand the importance of our function. Unfortunately, not enough.
You know, I was struck in the book by your insight into the human condition of the singer. And I suspect that your success as a stage director has to do with your great ability to understand and relate to singers. But you talk, at several points in the book, you talk about the fact that extramarital affairs are not unique to opera, and go on to talk about singers' preoccupation with the subject of romance while studying a score in rehearsal and performance. Later on you say, part of the problem is the nature of the job. Opera singers are constantly on the road, wrestling with intense emotions and dealing with admirers, flatterers, and opportunists. The profession offers a great deal of camaraderie, but theater by its nature is illusory. It can be hard to tell what's what. And then you talk about Truffaut, again in a different place, and you say, he said, we come together for a show. We have love affairs, we argue, we threaten suicide. At the end, we exchange addresses and phone numbers, we swear eternal friendship, and then we go our separate ways, and poof, nobody remembers anything or anybody. Your work is fantasy, and fantasies will do you in every time. And I developed in this a sense that you really found great empathy for the singer and what the singer sacrifices, the life of the singer. even though they drove you crazy, and there are wonderful stories about it in the book, my sense is that it's rooted in a deep appreciation for the trauma they go through to be artists.
But it's a very, very difficult profession, and especially for the ladies, you know, because if they have a husband who's not in the profession, he might not be very understanding and all that stuff, and then all of a sudden if they have children, and it's very difficult for them because from one side they're driven by the ambition, by the excitement, by the adulations of the audience, and et cetera, et cetera. From the other side, they're torn because there's a loved one, their children, there's a husband who is maybe supportive, and then maybe if he's got a personality of his own, he doesn't want to be. You know, there are other ladies, for example, who have married major domos. I mean, you know, I mean, that's their choice. The husband, I think I say that, you know, they pick up the laundry, they drop the kid off to the school, and they take the dog for walking, check all the reservations and all that stuff. And they're happy in that position. Those sopranos and mezzos are lucky that they have found a partner who doesn't mind. But a lot of the men then don't want to have that kind of a, you know, hangers-on attitude, or they want to be a man, macho, or, you know, and all that. So I think the ladies have it tougher than the men in our profession. And also remember, singing is such a difficult profession because a pianist, after you finish the piano, you put the head down and walk away. A violinist, you put your violin in a case. A singer, it's right here. If there's wind or there's cold, you know, and all that kind of stuff. So they have my understanding, and I like to really support them and understand the difficulty they have to balance a private life with a professional life. And it's harder for the ladies than it is for the men. So that's why I have that empathy. I really do. And it's not a condescending one. It's a very much of a human one.
No, and in the book it is, you know, you laugh at it, you sometimes grimace at the pain of dealing with some of the eccentricities, but it is definitely rooted in this appreciation, this understanding of what the life is like.
You're doing a Tosca, for example. You're emotional, dramatic, vocally demanding, and all that. And you're away from your husband and home and all that. And there's a cute little tenor as Cavaradossi, or, you know, or a nice macho baritone.
More likely a good-looking Scorca than a good-looking Cavaradossi.
When you're, especially when you're weak and you're a little bit tired and you're a little bit insecure, temptations are there, you know, and they have to go to the hotel or rent an apartment all alone and all that. So there's an incredible amount of temptations. And I understand that. I understand that. Some can deal with it, some cannot deal with it.
In one of your very funny stories, I loved the one about, and I've told many people about this, the James McCracken story about his relationship with the claque at the performance of Otello at the Verdi Festival. Can you tell us about that story?
Yes, well, James was one of my absolute favorites.
It shows in the book that you really liked him.
I adored him. He was such a generous man. As an artist, as a man, it was absolutely wonderful. In Italy, I did a lot of work in Italy, and in the 90s and not 60s and 70s and all that. I don't know if those claques now.
I was going to ask you if they still do.
I don't know because I haven't worked, the last time I worked there was about 4 or 5 years ago. But there's a formality about the claques. And usually they show up, the capo claque, in my days, they showed up in the dress rehearsal. But one of the funniest, before I tell the James story, the story about Tatiana Troianos. Tatiana, whom I adored, she was one of my absolute favorite artists. She was doing a first production in Italy. We were doing Così fan tutte together. And she was doing Dorabella at La Fenice. And all of a sudden, at the dress rehearsal, my assistant came and said, "Oh, Miss Troianos wants to talk to you. Miss Troianos wants to." So I rushed back to her dressing room, and there was a guy standing there. And she didn't, at that time, Tatiana did not speak Italian. And so I asked him, and he said he was a capo claque. I said, "Sweetheart, he's the head of the claque. Put this amount of money, or if you have an envelope, don't have an envelope, just give it to him and let it go. Don't make a case of it." And she did. She did.
How much would one pay to a claque?
I think in those days was like about, if you clad, like about $2,000 to $3,000. Yeah.
So not a small amount.
Not a small amount. And so with James was very sweet. It was a big production of Otello in honor of Toscanini and Verdi and all that. And he was doing, as an American, he was doing Otello in Italy for this incredible honor. Gavazzini was conducting and all that. And so the Capo Clack, right after, in an intermission at the dress rehearsal, went to the dressing room and all that. And Jimmy knew exactly what it was. So he doubled the amount. He gave the capo double what the rate was. And the guy said, oh, that's nice, that means you want more applause. He said, no. What I would like you to do, tell your whole group not to applaud for me. Because if only one man does it, I want to know it's for me. And and that was Jimmy. That was Jimmy. He paid double so that if he got one hand, he knew that was real. It was not bought, you see. So I don't know if today, I think Betsy, you might know, I don't know, with some of your artists. Yeah. So
and how many people would be in a clack?
Dependent in the theater. La Scala, a lot.
Really?
Over 30, yeah.
Really?
Over 30. But one of the sweetest things about clack was I did a Wozzeck in Italian in Palermo, which was actually one of the better theaters in Italy. And I had a superb artist, Nicola Rossi Lemony. So when the Capo Clack, I was in his dressing room when the Capo Clack came. And so Nicola looked at him and said, no, in this opera I have no arias.
That's very funny. That's very funny.
And he didn't pay it.
No, but I really love the McCracken story about, what applause I earn, I want to know I earned it, and that I didn't pay for it.
Jimmy was one of the most generous human beings I ever met.
Yeah.
And he was, I'll tell you another wonderful story about me. When he hit it big in Zurich, Dr. Graf believed in him. Because at the Met, his biggest role was Parpignol in La Bohème. And he did Giuseppe in Traviata. So Dr.
The Messenger and Aida.
Messenger and Aida. And Dr. Graf gave him the Otello, and he was sensational and wonderful. And in Zurich Opera House, people would just line up for his autograph and all that. All of a sudden, all the big companies started asking him for roles. They invited him for Pagliacci, the roles he had never done. So of all of us immigrants in Zurich, Jimmy was doing the best. And all of us were kind of, like my wife and I, we had orange crates for our dining room and all that. So then what he organized in his house, like when he did Pagliacci, then I would go to his house and we'd go to the living room and I would move the furniture around and I would stage it. I could do Nedda, I could do Sylvia, I did the whole thing for him. And so then he would go to Vienna. I said, I've done Pagliacci. So he didn't know he had never done it. So we did a few of those operas together and all that. And then one morning, my wife and I, we had an apartment on the 3rd floor. About 8 or 9 in the morning, the doorbell rings, and there's some movers. I said, we haven't ordered anything. I said, oh, no. There's a dining room with 4 chairs. It was Jimmy. Send it to us as a gift so that we wouldn't have the orange crates.
This was wonderful.
And that's a Jim McCracken. That's why he was a very, he died, unfortunately.
He was very young.
Very young, yeah, And I don't think the Met ever appreciated it. I was very angry at that because they took him for granted.
And I remember the great success he had when he stepped into the Tannhauser
in
the new production, which was,
and
it was fabulous. Mr. Vickers had pulled out, and McCracken went in and had a great success with it.
But when they telecast it, they gave it to Joan. They didn't give it to Jimmy.
Yeah, interesting.
So, they were shameful with them.
In the book, there's so much that you talk about, and I just pulled some of my favorite pieces here. There is one in the chapter called "Coming to a Head." you speak about Wilhelm Wagner as the father of Regietheater.
Exactly.
And you say, short on materials and manpower, directors were unable to create extravagant, realistic productions of previous decades, so they turned to abstraction. In other words, they focused inward instead of outward, and their productions invited audiences to do likewise. I mean, that puts a very positive spin on a kind of school of direction that perhaps has gotten a bad reputation in the United States.
Well, I think in the United States, it deserves a bad reputation, because I think that they're not just, because for me, this kind of, I mean, first I'll just finish this up and then we'll go to Vina. Because what I find nowadays, because when you see the pictures of the chorus men sitting on toilet seats and with their pants down and having a newspaper, and that's the...
And that really was Ballo and Mascara in Barcelona,
exactly.
Absolutely.
So, but it made all the papers. It made internationally, everybody. And a young stage director now is tempted to, he feels that the way he can establish his credit is to be outrageous or shock and all that. It's not serving the piece anymore. Not everybody, but I think it's become fashionable. But for me, I find that it's a wrong principle. For me, for example, when you do a conception, I just recently saw a horrific production of Don Quixote of Massenet, and he was in Tarte de la Monnaie on that. The stage director had decided that it really was not about Don Quixote and Sancho, it was about Massenet. Okay, I think that's interesting. I mean, but it's like, if I could use this analogy, it's like, for example, you take the soundtrack of Casablanca as a film, and then you put it on an Errol Flynn Western. And all are fabulous composers. Mozart, Verdi, all these wonderful people. Every note they composed was motivated by the word. They got the libretto first, especially somebody like Verdi, who was murder on his librettos. And the context of the note is motivated by the dramatic concept, psychological concept of the word. That's why Verdi chose that note. The minute you take that away and you put another context on it, you have a different story. You don't have that. So I have nothing against modernizing productions, but not at the expense of what the composer has done. I can modernize it, but why don't you get somebody to write your version? If you want to write the life of Massenet, that's a very noble idea.
Commission the opera.
Commission the opera. And write that, but Don Quixote is I happen to love Massenet, and I'm a little selfish because I even was given a proclamation by Massenet family as his grandson, because I had done a lot of Massenet, Esclavon, all that stuff. And he gave me a wonderful proclamation saying, in French, le porteur de flambeau de Massenet.
How wonderful.
The carrier of the torch of Massenet. So naturally I'm prejudiced. So, so I find that, and I watched that production, and it was sad because the gentleman who did Don Quixote, he had been a Sancho with me in my production of Don Quixote in Geneva. It was Joseph Van Damme. He's a superb artist. Why not let him do Don Quixote? Why not let him do the Massenet version and then have a composer write your version? And I think I have nothing against, but I find that we get stuck into that.
And yet when you first saw the work of Wilhelm Wagner, it was illuminating for you.
It was. I thought, I never forget my exposure to his Parsifal. From the middle of first act, I started crying. At the end of it, I was drained. It was emotionally, visually, it was what Wagner had created. Do you see what I mean? It wasn't somebody's personal, like right now they're doing this Lohengrin that all the choruses are rats. Because nudge, nudge, wink, wink, you know what it is, that's the society. I mean, you know, excuse me. Did Wagner write that music for the rats? I mean, I don't think so. You know, so I think that is the problem I have.
I loved your reference to Mozart. I love Mozart. You say being able to perform Mozart meant you were not only a fine singer, but also disciplined, capable of working with a conductor, and, owing to the sophistication of many of the plots, capable of taking direction. Mozart operas became a kind of calling card, a gateway to invitations for other kinds of work throughout the world from great conductors. Do you still think that about the Mozart singer as kind of the...
I think times have changed. In the 60s and 70s, I think very few Italian singers would do Mozart. They didn't find it grateful. So there were some, Ilva Ligabue, of course Graziella Sciutti was brilliant, and there were some that were wonderful. Bruscantini was very good. But most of them would have rather done the Italian operas, the Puccini's and Verdi's and all the other stuff. And so, but when the Italian artists, like this wonderful soprano called Ilva Ligabue, and she then would do Elvira and all that, and then they would get international careers. They would then, because otherwise most of them, like I think I mentioned that in the book, I did a magic flute in Rome with a magnificent ensemble conducting. Just about everybody in it, except Monostatos, was a foreigner.
You talked about that.
Peter Schreier was Tamino, Talvala was Sarastro, and all that stuff. And then the conductor was Arnserme, Swiss friends, you know. So, but the Italians didn't have the patience for Mozart. I should also say they lacked the discipline. Mozart demands discipline, you know, and that is the thing, you know. But then it's a genius.
You tell an extraordinary story about your production of the Tales of Hoffmann in Tehran. It's just an amazing circumstance. And I can imagine it must have been very hard for you, having been born and brought up in Iran and having family still in Iran, to have gone through this experience that you did with this Tales of Hoffmann. Would you tell that story?
Well, yeah, but of course in the 1971, the Shah of Iran all of a sudden kind of fabricated anniversary of 2,500 years of Iran. I don't know who kept count, but
no one's around to disagree.
And so all of a sudden, and they built an opera house, a wonderful opera house in Tehran, by the same architect who built the Deutsche Oper in Berlin. I had everything, turntables and elevators and all that stuff. And they were looking for an Iranian to kind of run it, and so they kind of came to see me, and I was not going to move from Geneva to Tehran, Iran, so I kind of talked him into making me as a kind of an artistic advisor. So then I went there, and we had wonderful artists. I mean, Tito Gobbi, I mean, you know, Beverly Sills, some really, you know, because money was no object. Money was, but it was an incredibly difficult situation, because I mean, talk about intrigues in Italy. They were babies compared to the intrigues in Tehran, you know. And so that was hard. But I had to go because of the fact my father was there, and we had a wonderful reunion after many years. And so it was good. But it was a nightmare, absolutely. And then of course the mullahs came, and then that was the end of it. Now it's a temple of religion or something.
It's an amazing story, and I recommend that you read it. You also offer up some professional advice in the book. This is sort of your telling someone else's advice to you. When you get very angry, wait 24 hours before showing it. Make sure you're calm when you say something hard. Then your anger will be justifiable, not just an outburst.
Which is very true. It was Günther Renner who taught me that. He was a wonderful director. I met him on my first year in Salzburg Festival, and I admired him greatly. He was a superb, and served the text and the music and all that. And so one time we were having kind of a lunch or something together, and And I asked.
You were anchored at the Vienna Staatsoper chorus, I think.
Oh, that was then I used it. For,
okay, right.
Yeah,
right.
and then so I learned it from him, and then the chorus of the Vienna Staatsoper, they were disastrous. They didn't know the music. And so I was shocked, and I was doing fanciulla, which are all these little rolls and all that stuff. So I remembered Reinhard saying that, so I cooled it the first day. They didn't know. So the next day when I was calm, and I put on the Shena, and I said that, oh, gentlemen, I said, my dream was working in Vienna at the Staatsoper and all that. But unfortunately, I didn't know that I was faced with an amateur chorus. I was very calm. Wow, did I call a scandal? The Viennese, everything is a scandal, as you know. So that was that. I learned it from Brenner.
But a lesson you probably used other times in your life.
Oh, definitely, because also I find that if you're a stage director, you have to you establish the mood and the productivity of the rehearsal. You cannot, if you can't deal with it, don't have a rehearsal. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Because they're insecure, they're learning, they're developing and all that. So you got to be like a much more of a father, a kind of calming influence to work with them, encourage them, give them whatever they want. But then when they start taking advantage, then you have to prove that, you've had enough. Mm-hmm. So that was the lesson.
But wait 24 hours.
Wait 24 hours, yes.
I have a couple more questions. And the next one is a reflection of my own deep devotion. At the end, you list some of the most wonderful singers that you've worked with.
Right.
But you save a special chapter at the end for Joan Sutherland. And I want to hear why Joan warrants a special chapter.
She was one of the highlights of my career and my private life. We became very, very good friends. She was an amazingly wonderful human being. Warm, unpretentious, and extremely, so natural. She was real, and we became very good friends because in Switzerland, our homes were only about 45 minutes away from each other. And it was just to see Joan, being in the kitchen and cooking something or doing this. I mean, it was just, and then stand next to her on rehearsal and have her sing these unbelievable sounds. I did lots of productions with her.
I think you said in the book that she did more with you than any other single stage director.
we got because we ended up by doing a lot variety. I mean, when you look at the list of stuff we did together, everything from Huguenots and Esclarmonde to Merry Widow and Fledermaus. I mean, and like in Fledermaus, she was so charming. So like the first time we did it together, my Alfred was Ragnar Ulfung, who was very short. And so I would tell Joan, I said, do you mind if I play that for a joke? No, she said, go for it. So every time Ragnar was going to kiss her, he would put a chair next to her and go out. And then in the trio, I had Ragnar pull her down on his lap, and then of course he disappeared. And then Ragnar was a brilliant actor. So then there was Joan, and then for his lines,
So funny.
So it was hysterical. And so they got along. She was like that, she was like that. And then of course when she did the Czardas in the second act, Ricky added more cadenzas. I mean, that's tough enough to do. So and then all of a sudden I come and I said, Joan, can I show you a couple of steps of the Czardas? She said, you're kidding. So she did the couple of steps of Czardas, on the cadenzas. No, I adore. As a human being, she was unbelievable. It's not just as an artist, just as a person.
It was wonderful to turn the page and to see then a chapter, after you had recited all of these other wonderful singers, John Vickers and others, to turn the page and see the chapter.
She was really wonderful. As a human being, she was one of the highlights of my career. And she did so many things for me, fundraising, master classes, and all that stuff. She would come so generously.
That's wonderful. And then I guess the last note is another piece of advice. Whenever there seemed to be real trouble at home in the opera house, you and a glass of scotch.
I had my bottle.
Whether it was in Verona or wherever.
I had my bottle, and because it just sometimes you have to kind of take a couple of shots.
What kind of scotch?
Actually, the best. No, it really, and then as long as you don't get hooked.
Right, absolutely.
As long as you don't get hooked. But you need some kind of an escape. Because, remember, my first year I started in San Francisco, we had an earthquake. The second year, we had an orchestra strike. I mean, so scotch was very handy.
Oh, my word. Oh. Well, I mean, all of these stories are so wonderfully told in the book. And I said to Lotfi on the phone yesterday that I brought it away with me for a weekend, and I started it after dinner and just got halfway through and got into bed and just had this wonderful late afternoon and early evening and late night of reading through the book. It's just a wonderful read. Questions from any of our guests here today? Any questions about, please?
Yes. First of all, I just want to say thank you for your contributions.
Well, thank you.
When I was told that you was going to be here, then I met many people in the world, and I like to brag about singing opera, whether I'm in the supermarket or the airport. And many people actually say, well, don't you have to speak the language in order to understand? I say, oh, no, they got the super titles, so it's so nice. My question, in the, I don't want to say failing economy, what appears to be the failing economy, and the man who's actually got San Francisco out of that major earthquake, because I've studied San Francisco, they told me where the highway used to be. I'm thinking, well, there's no highway here now. What would you suggest companies do now so they don't have to cut seasons and budgets, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, to tell you the honest truth, I find when the times are tough, you've got to be better. You have to excite your audience. To retrench and all that stuff is totally wrong. I find that also is a time for you to develop your imagination. Find newer ways of doing things rather than say, oh no, I gotta have those doors there and I gotta have that there and all that and all that. Don't use those excuses. Use your imagination, and that's why I use Wieland Wagner's example. Because after the Second World War, Germany was devastated. And none of the theaters really could afford anything. So then what he did, he went through this wonderful psychological aspect of the motivations of Isolde and all that kind of stuff. I disagree because sometimes some of my colleagues, when times get tough, they start playing it safe. That's the wrong time. That is absolutely the wrong time. When people are paying all that money for a ticket, they better get something for it. They better get an excitement. They get to take them away from the realities, take them away from the, So I don't believe in that. I find that you really got to be much more imaginative. You've got to create things that the audience wants to put the last dollar on it, to come and see it, to get away from the madness of the banking and mortgages and all that kind of stuff. So and then it stimulates the imagination. If you're a designer, what can you do with less money? You can't say, oh, the quality is on money. That's nonsense. Quality is on imagination. It's not just on money. I hope that answers your question.
Our business needs you still.
For sure. Yes, ma'am.
My question is sort of a tag off of his. First of all, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate what you had to say about, I guess, sensationalism that's used on stage and appreciating those who don't have to, veer off in that direction in order to make an action clear on stage. I kind of feel that the fundraising efforts of companies across America are using some sort of sensationalism in that a lot of the fees and such are being carried down into the singers. I know 10 years ago when I was auditioning in the circuit, very rarely did you hear of companies charging fees and whatnot to singers to audition for companies.
Is that what they're doing now?
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Are they?
Very common.
Yep.
Very common. Anywhere from, you can go per application fee, then,
I'm sorry. I find that sad, especially for young artists. Because to prepare yourself for a career in opera is so demanding. The coaches you have to pay, the voice teachers you have to pay, you have to do your hair, you got to get a new dress, you got to do all that. So I think I find I don't agree with it. I don't want an opera company say that, okay, send me $40 so I can listen to you. I mean, so that basically is their prejudice. They want your $40. They don't give a damn about how you sing.
well, and a lot of people say, okay, go networking and that kind of thing, and I'm a huge networker. I like to go out and meet a lot of people, try to sing for them whenever I can. But sometimes you may not get to the company unless you do, $40.
No, I understand that,
And you're
yeah.
not even guaranteed that you're going to be heard.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, I don't know, I mean, obviously you state your opinion and you're in favor of that, but what do you feel that companies should be doing in order to maybe have those harder conversations with the donors and patrons, saying that in order to run a business here and to support our singers and have healthy singers on stage, we need to be supported too in just, like I said, that we're not, the body and mind are fatigable, and if you have those bodies and mind fatigable out on stage, we're not going to perform to the best of our
You bring up some topics that we discuss a lot in our singer training forum and elsewhere around Opera America, and there's always a lively debate about that question. We can chat about it, once we break here. But there's no doubt that communicating to patrons that their support is needed at all levels, even to help support auditions so the singers are not perhaps having to pay for their auditions. That's something that everyone should hear about. Any last questions? Betsy?
Just to comment about what you say, that it goes also with what Lotfi was saying about hard times and now using imagination and all that. I think you have to remember that the opera companies and the people who are hearing auditions, that their goal is to choose people to be in that production that they're doing. Their goal is not to help young singers get their first job.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons that Lotfi especially was one of the people who was responsible for starting the Young Artist Program in Canada, in Toronto, had a wonderful Canadian opera ensemble for their young singers. I think you started that, didn't you?
I did.
Yeah, and in that kind of situation, the young singers were able to perform scenes, complete operas in some cases.
And we organize auditions for them. I mean, the COC still does. That they had,
The point that I'm making is that in these days, when someone comes to New York specifically to do an audition as head of a young, smaller company, their goal is, yes, to hear as many singers as they can, but they will tell the managers what the repertoire is that they're planning to do, what singers they're looking for, what needs to be cast. And that's their goal, to find those specific singers. And for a young singer, it can be frustrating, because what if you don't fit into their repertoire? Are they obligated to hear you? I don't know. I think what their major goal is to hear singers who will be in the productions that they want to do.
Betsy, and thank you for that. It's a huge topic, and we're just so grateful to have your voice here, and Lotfi, so grateful to have you here.
Well, thank you.
On the occasion of the new book, and I recommend it to everyone. There are copies for sale in the back of the room here. We have some, and unfortunately the audience that's watching this on our live stream cannot enjoy the wine that we have. We don't have scotch, I'm sorry to say, but we do have some wine, and we invite our guests to join us for some wine to talk some more with Lotfi and with one another. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all for being here.